Okay. Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
All
So
right.
if you want to go ahead and let people know a little bit more about your recent work.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for coming in tonight. We have a nice small group, and I'm hoping that we can go back and forth, back and forth. And we're going to be talking about something that's obviously very close to me, and that is the origin, depth, and structure of human consciousness itself. I think it's very telling, at least for me, that I wrote this book at a time when I felt that we as a species were stumbling toward a series of conflagrations, and that meaningful steps and meaningful shifts were underway in the way that we kind of think about ourselves. And tonight, we are again on the eve of war. And we're on the eve of war between powerful political and cultural blocs on the planet. So that in and of itself is, to me, a very nerve-wracking realization. The other realization that's just more positive, and I hope that we can get into that tonight, is that for the first time in the history of our species, we're stepping off the planet. The purely military exploration of space is still going on for sure, but also it's now being supplanted gradually by the commercial exploration of space. And that is a monumental thing. It's a monumental event in human consciousness. And so those events are stepping off the planet for the first time safely and under our own power. And the fact that all the peoples of the world are coming together rightly, well, not rightly or wrongly, but are being forced to come together through global pandemics, recognizing that no nation is actually separate from any other nation. This coronavirus didn't particularly respect any political boundaries whatsoever. It just came and went as it chose. And mercifully, it's beginning to fade. But we had 2 years in which each one of us wondered about our own safety. And so the boundaries of the world are changing. And I wanted to argue in this book that while the surface changes of our boundaries are between us as nations and peoples and races and so forth is changing, deep down, our fundamental identification with each other is actually getting deeper and more resonant and more profound. And that is the African roots of all human beings. We may look differently in facial, ethnic, languages, and so on, but we are still fundamentally the same species, biologically, serologically in terms of our blood, genetically, and so forth. And all the others are beautiful diversifications within that womb, within that loom, I should say. So I want to talk about that tonight, depending on where our conversation sort of goes. So that's the thrust of this book, Our African Unconscious. Not yours, not mine, no, our, because we're all shared in this. And as we'll find out as we go along tonight, that ancient civilized peoples in the past, particularly the Kemetic Egyptian peoples, they knew about phenomena that we're studying and rediscovering today, and that is consciousness, but also the unconscious mind. And I hope that we can get to this tonight, the superconscious level of the mind, the superconscious level of the mind. And so I guess that's what I would say by way of introduction, and that's kind of like see where we roll.
Right on. Well, one of the things that I found fascinating in reviewing some of the descriptions of our African consciousness is, it's undeniably, I don't want to use the word certain because, that's a tough word, but I mean, there's a lot of continuity of different disciplines,
yes,
all speaking to the idea that, look, there's a lot of similarity, there's a lot of pointing back to Africa and looking
Mhm.
at us as we came out of Africa, or as we,
Mhm.
began as a species. And maybe you could speak a little bit to the idea of our, what were they like? Like, at what point did we begin to,
Mm.
the scope of it? Because I mean, we're talking millions of years
We're
back.
talking millions of years. And in fact, uh, approximately 6 to 7 million years ago, some people stretch it back to 8, and some people as recently as 6, but somewhere in there between 6 and 8 million years ago, probably around 6, a monumental event occurred. And the primate ape line split off from another primate line. They went off in different directions. And out of that other one, second one, a whole group of pre-human type species arose. They were called Australopithecines of various kinds. And they roamed around mostly in East Africa and South Africa for millions upon millions of years. And they became more refined as they went along. Eventually, these Australopithecines themselves became much more sophisticated, branching off and so on and so forth. More evolved forms emerged. And eventually, out of that particular branch of the tree came the hominid line, the Homo sapien line. And then there were a lot of diversifications and branches within that. And then approximately about 1 1.5 years ago, depending on which researchers you like, but roughly around in there, a little bit more than 1 million years ago, our species began its earliest sort of emergence.
Okay.
And there were diversifications within that. Neanderthals, we can go on and on and on, many of them still unearthed. But about 200,000 to 250,000 years ago, our particular species, Homo sapiens sapiens, us, anatomically modern human beings, emerged.
Mm-hmm.
And we emerged in the same place in the East African highlands, in present day Tanzania, Kenya, around in there. And we thrived pretty much looking the way that I look, many other people look today. And that was the case for a good, at the most conservative, 150,000 years. And then we began leaving Africa in waves, different groups of us. Eventually, the Homo sapiens traveled to every part of the planet with the exception of Antarctica. We were all over the place, varying ways of doing that. And I devoted the first chapter of the book to that, the ways of hominids and their stock. But the point I want to make here is that out of our hanging out for 200 to 250,000 years ago, again, a very conservative 150,000 years ago, that continued. And then in the last 25 to 35,000 years ago, only then have so-called different races appeared. Before that time, we all looked pretty much the same. So-called human races only began around that period of time, 25 to 35,000 years ago. And that was under the press of ecological and surface changes that we needed to make to adapt to the environment that we were in. But it's just tiny on the surface. Deeper down, the structures are all the same. Our cognitive structures, the way our brains operate, the way our nervous systems operate, all of our major anatomical features, our brain size, all of that was all in place at least 150,000 to 200,000 years ago.
Wow.
So racial diversification is a relatively recent event, and we can see today that is beginning to undergo changes too, because look at how people are moving from one continent to another. So what we look like today is not what we will look like in 100 years. because the people are just are meeting each other and cross-fertilizing, you know? So this is a very interesting time. And again, to me, it's a very exciting time and precarious time because we are stepping off the planet. And I believe that we need to take a deeper, more profound look into our origins to see who we really, really, really are. Because heading out into space, we don't know what we're going to encounter. So we need to have our house in order.
Absolutely. And
yes,
one of the original, well, I guess I shouldn't say original, but one of the ways that humankind has developed is thinking about morality, and morality oftentimes is tied to spirituality.
Yes.
And one of the things that you bring up during this period of emergence that you were just speaking about earlier, of human emergence, is the development of spirituality. I mean,
yes,
East West is a new age bookstore. This is, something that people who are less inclined to be tribal about it and their spiritual beliefs. But can you say a little bit about, what was this new emergent? And you said it's discovered, that we
yes.
discovered.
About one of the things that differentiates our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, from the other hominid types, and there were a lot of others, by the way. We weren't the only ones. We weren't, but we were the ones who survived and eventually came to dominate the planet. Okay, all the others died off for what reasons that we don't really know, but some 50,000 years ago, an amazing phenomena occurred. And we're not exactly sure what caused it, but we do know roughly about when it occurred. Is that human beings all over the planet, that Homo sapiens species all over the planet, began to do things that were symbolic. We began to paint on cave walls, whether it was in South Africa, whether it was in Europe, whether it was in China. We began, symbolism emerged in our consciousness. And we started doing something remarkable. We started burying the dead. We did. And, after millennia of watching the tides of the waters, watching the stars, watching the phases of the moon, watching the world around us change through different seasons, we began to get this idea of cycles and repetition. And when we began to differentiate our waking experience from our dreaming experience, because that doesn't happen automatically. It took a long time for people to figure out that when they were asleep, the world was actually different than when they were awake. It's like when a child does. A child has to discover that it has dreams.
Right.
It has to separate from it. But from that dreaming experience, we had an intuition, I believe, that something about us continued on, went further. And we didn't know what it was, but we knew it had something to do with our minds and our bodies that was not the same all the time. There was something more to us than our physical selves. And we began to bury the dead. We began to bury the dead. So my sense is that that spiritual realization is something we observe. Also, our species, variations of our species, which included Neanderthals, and Neanderthals also buried his dead. He did. And then our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, who came along later, did the same thing. So my supposition is that we did not invent spirituality. Like the winds, the waves, tides, and gravity, we noticed it, we discovered it. And then we began to refine it over thousands of years. And we started burying the dead. And then another revolution happened in our cognitive capacities and emerged in our consciousness about very conservative, probably 5,000 years ago, although some people trace it back to 10,500 years, and we'll get into the reason why that. But at least 5,000 years before Christ, there arose a cult in Africa, in ancient Kemetic Egypt in Africa, where they taught that you didn't only bury the dead, but you had to bury the dead in certain kinds of ways, because somewhere down the road, something about that deceased person would reemerge as one of the cycles in nature. And that's when we began the idea of not only burial of the dead, but the idea of reincarnation began to emerge in human consciousness. Why? Because there were so many other cycles we observed outside of ourselves, and we observed cycles going on within our own bodies. We observed the cycles going on in women's bodies, and it became a natural supposition that there's something about us, inside of us, that also happens in cycles. We began, and that's when the intuition of reincarnation emerged in human consciousness at a conservative 5,000 years before Christ. Now I say it might be different because there are many indications that this idea may have been around as early as 10,500 BCE. Why that?
Yeah.
The Sphinx, the ancient Kemetic Egyptian Sphinx, he is carved, the body of a lion and the head of a human being, a man. He's looking due east into the vernal equinox, into the constellation of Leo the lion in 10,500 BCE. That's no accident. That's no accident. 10,500 BCE. The pyramid age, quote unquote pyramid age, was 2,500 BCE, around in there. No, the ancient Kemetic Egyptians write about, document their own civilization as occurring in 10,500 BCE. They called it Zep Tepi, the splendid time of the first time. That's when they dated. So somewhere in there, the idea of reincarnation took firm hold. We didn't quite understand it, how it worked, but we knew something repeated itself, and that idea is now firmly entrenched in human consciousness. There's some people who say it's real, some people say it's not real, but everybody thinks about that.
Oh, yeah.
We all know that idea, okay? And it's not as far-fetched. And you can be a quantum physicist and believe in reincarnation, or you can be an atheist and believe in reincarnation. It is not necessarily about God. It's about the recycling of the human consciousness. And all of that emerged out of our species, and that is the African origin of human consciousness, which is how the book, Our African Unconscious, begins. The African origin of human consciousness, the waves of human stock. And I spent a decent amount of time, perhaps an obsessive amount of time, but documenting the archaeological, paleontological, solid bones and data information about that. So that's, and genetically, we know that's the case today. By population genetics, we know it from seriological studies, archaeology, paleontology, anthropology. It's pretty tight.
Yeah.
Pretty tight. And one other thing I just want to mention at this point is that that's also reflected, that very story is reflected in our nervous systems. Yes, in our nervous systems, because when we begin our journey in our mother's womb, we begin as a little black DOS, when the egg and sperm come together in the blastula. And over time, that blastula begins to elongate in our mother's womb by direct current. And that direct current is supplied by a particular biochemical process referred to as melanin.
Right.
And why is it dark? Because it absorbs light. It absorbs quanta. Not only does it absorb quanta, it absorbs it and translates it into higher and more complex forms. And that is what happens in embryogenesis. That's what happens in our mother's womb. That's what happens. And later on, it develops and leads to the elaboration of our nervous system. So your nervous system, your brain, behind the skull, beneath the skull, where the sun doesn't shine, is dark. Your brain is dark because it absorbs light. And of all the creatures on the planet Earth, those with the greatest amount of this neuro or nerve melanin. It's not skin melanin, it's nerve melanin, brain melanin. The ones who have the most are the mammals.
Yeah.
Of all the mammals, the ones with the highest concentration are the primates. Of the primates, the ones who have the densest amount are the great apes. And the only ones more are the chimpanzee, and the only one more than the chimpanzee is a human being.
Wow.
So that's a pretty tight correlation, and it's about absorbing light. It's an evolutionary phenomenon, and it parallels our rise as a species from our more primitive ancestors to us now, and it suggests, it hints at where we will be heading in the future. That's why I began this with talking about we are beginning during this exciting period of stepping off the planet. We're entering a new evolutionary cycle. We're entering a new evolutionary cycle.
Yeah.
You know, think about that.
That's not small beans.
No, we're not. We're heading toward a solar consciousness. We are. And if we don't extinguish ourselves,
Right. Yeah.
imagine what we'll be in 1,000 years. Right. We will be solar beings.
Absolutely.
Visiting other planets, and we'll look back on these days and hopefully with some compassion.
Well, yeah, I certainly hope so. I mean, it
comes out of that African genesis of all of us, and we all have access to that. That is our collective unconscious. Our racial unconscious and our collective unconscious is rooted in an African origin. And by the way, Sigmund Freud knew this. Yes, he did. In his office in Vienna, it was littered with African, Egyptian, and other Egyptian statues. And he referred to it as the racial memory. Now, Sigmund Freud was a European, so he couldn't identify with being African back at that time in the late 19th century. Society wouldn't have allowed him to do it.
Absolutely.
The other great psychiatrist at that time was Carl Jung. And Carl Jung knew it too. And he said so. He said so in his book of Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, that he knew that deep, deep down, he was an African. Carl Jung.
Wow.
So it is there. And we're just fortunate enough to be able to talk about it out loud in this program and others, because the climate is allowing that to happen. There's still a lot of pushback, believe me.
Oh, yeah.
I've experienced a whole lot of people for whom the whole idea is they recoil at it.
Sure, it's very controversial, but why? Why would it be controversial when you got so much back?
It's about identity politics and how we've been conditioned. And a lot of people in political power remain in political power by exploiting those fears and anxieties that people have. Yeah. Look at all the laws that are being passed in many states to keep us ignorant. Because they're afraid. I understand it, but it will not work. And in the long run, this is where we're heading as a species. And we will either adapt to that or we will die off.
Now, do you think about how this wedge began? Because that's interesting to people who might not necessarily identify as African, but there was some, like, Jung can point out that looking deep inside, he could recognize the actual racial memory.
Yes.
But when did was there some sort of, do you feel like there was a catastrophe, or when did people begin to look, and we see a question here in that thing that's similar to mine, when did people begin to look at Africa as a negative? And why did they wedge?
That's a relatively recent phenomenon. That occurred in the Western world anyway, around the end of the Middle Ages. Up until that time, even in Europe, up until that time, the ideal of what a civilization was ancient Egypt. And during the Renaissance, people would build their buildings and others on models that they took from ancient Egypt. And then they two monumental things happen. The slave trade, okay? And the slave trade was catastrophic for Africa and catastrophic for Europe for different reasons, but it was catastrophic. And then what made it became even more complex was that during the time of Napoleon invaded ancient Egypt. He invaded Egypt, I should say. And when he got there, he made a horrific discovery. He discovered that the people of ancient Egypt, hanging around the Nile, pyramids, and so on and so forth, was a significant proportion of the population was Black African. And imagine the conflict. You have people that you've enslaved on the one hand, but on the other, you're going down there and praising their civilization. And it created an intellectual crisis in Western academia and Western politics. And so all of a sudden, around 1800, you begin to find the academics no longer thinking about ancient Egypt, but thinking about ancient Greece and Rome. That's when they became the models of ancient civilization. Because otherwise it was too big of a conflict. And that's when we began, quote, scientific racism, unquote, where people began to do cranial head measurements and how long the arms and so on and so forth to, quote, scientifically prove it. And then that percolated down into the academy. It fit with the slaveholders. That worked out economically for them. And so, the die was cast.
Right.
And then you have centuries of people who are fed a steady diet of that, Black, white, and otherwise. And so we have the present crisis today. It's receding somewhat, but it's still very deeply ingrained. Now, we know in the long run, it's not sustainable. Everybody knows in the long run, it's not sustainable.
Yeah.
But in the short run, it might be. Plus, we have one other crisis we haven't mentioned yet. And this is also a biological crisis. Because of our ecological crisis, and because of the pollution of the skies and the atmosphere, particularly the ionosphere, the layer of the ionosphere is getting thinner and thinner and thinner. The net effect of that is that the harmful ultraviolet rays of the sun are breaking through more and more. There's been a significant radical increase in basal carcinomas, skin cancers, in Australia and the northern parts of Europe. That doesn't affect people who have darker skin. That affects people with lighter skin. In order to adapt and survive, people who with lighter skin are going to naturally have to develop darker skin, and they will. They will. It's inevitable. Human beings will adapt to the environment. And there are already many pharmaceutical companies that are experimenting with ways of darkening people's skin. Wow. Yes, there are. And you're going to find that in the future, that's going to be a big business. Because it's adaptive. And, otherwise, you don't find a large albino population in Africa.
Right. Yeah.
When they spontaneously do occur, they don't last very long.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, we can't seem to stop it. We can't seem to get our act together enough to stop it. So it's going to happen. So all of these factors will lead us to continually evolve as a species, and we will come to terms with it. Sometimes painfully, but we will come to terms with it. So all of those lead me to believe that the African origin of human consciousness will continue to mutate in a positive way, and that we will intellectually and spiritually rise to the occasion. When we begin to move out more and more into space, when we recognize that the pandemics don't have any respect for our national boundaries,
Yeah.
that, you know, tanks and guns and so forth, they're not going to stop it. We will have to do a deeper reflection. And that's when I think that we're going to have a reawakening of human consciousness. I really do. Of necessity. And it come from an evolutionary survival place. But yes.
Yeah, I mean, being that I've seen and have hosted a lot of talks with a lot of different gurus and teachers, and I've noticed that there has always been at least one section of their teaching where they're dealing with light.
Yes,
and right. You know, that's so
it's fundamental.
Fundamental, yeah, absolutely.
It's fundamental. Our brains are developed to respond to light. The thing about melanin and neuromelanin, particularly neuromelanin or brain melanin, which is the same with everybody, is that it absorbs light, it attracts light, literally quantum. And all spiritual disciplines around the world, regardless of how their practice may differ from each other, all get around to the worship of light in one way or another. So light is instrumental, and light is also an evolutionary, something that we have evolved in evolution to express in higher and higher, more refined ways. Yes.
And then, so this kind of begs the question, we see the long stream of religious and spiritual practices dealing with light.
Yes.
And we see, on the other hand, science grappling with a lot of questions about survival of the species and things like that. What do you foresee now coming as our next evolutionary step? You had made some remark earlier about the super consciousness. Does that have anything to do with that?
Yes, I do. I think that we're going to gradually evolve and recognize the super conscious. For those of you who may not be familiar, most of us are aware certainly of a level of our consciousness called the waking state consciousness. Okay. And that's what presumably we're all in now. And over the last 150 years or so, we folks in the Western world had rediscovered the unconscious, what was below consciousness. And that was, elucidated by Freud and to some extent by Jung, but certainly Freud. It was a domain of energy drives, dynamisms, sexuality, repressed sexuality, all of those. And we did not pay much attention to that level of consciousness above that, the level of consciousness that is the source of inspiration, insight, creativity, religious and spiritual intoxication of one form or another, profound insight into the nature of reality in science and other areas. That's where that comes from, the superconscious. And its dynamics are very different from the dynamics of the waking state or the unconscious. And we've just come through a last century where we've fallen in love with the unconscious. Okay, what is the unconscious? It is about things that we usually put in the cellar of our mind, in the basement. Okay, well, what does that mean for culture, public discourse? We talk about things that we would have never talked about before. A lot of it very crass.
Yeah, definitely.
It is, because that's all in the unconscious. And it's legitimate, but we have at the same time ignored the more sublime levels of our consciousness. The ancient Kemetic Egyptians knew about the unconscious. They're not, they knew about it. They called it by name, by the way. They called it the primeval waters of Nun, or the all-black Amentat, the underworld mind or the underworld consciousness that emerged. So they knew about the unconscious mind. But they also knew about the superconscious. And that was a place where the divine inspirations, that's how they understood it, came. their divine ideas, um, their insights into science and so forth, they came from the superconscious level of the mind. And India, contemporary India and ancient India, they also recognize the superconscious, but one attained it through states of meditation, samadhi, satori. Various disciplines do that. We are beginning to explore that here in the Western part of the world. We call our name for it is a superconscious level of the mind. That is what will elevate us. And I believe as a species, as we become of necessity more tolerant and inclusive of each other, and recognizing that a lot of our differences are not only are they petty, but they're dangerous. Yeah. And that we have to integrate ourselves in order to reach a deeper, higher union. And the superconscious is that toward which we are evolving. And I think it will come as a natural phenomenon because it offers more. I mean, most of our political and economic paradigms are in severe crisis.
Absolutely.
This is what is commonly referred to as late stage capitalism.
Right.
I mean, it's late stage because it is not going to survive as it is now. There are too many people and millions upon millions upon millions of people that know it's not working for them. Yes, capitalism has raised millions and millions and millions of people out of poverty. That is for sure. It has been one of the great liberating forces. But now it's gotten to the point where a lot of people know that, the game is rigged.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's rigged.
Yeah, you can't say more clear than that.
Yeah, a small percentage are getting richer and richer and richer. Yeah. And others are barely hanging on and then fighting themselves over the pieces of cheese that fall off the table. Yeah. Meanwhile, oligarchs are swallowing it all up. People know that this isn't going to work. We don't know exactly what we're going to replace it with, but this isn't going to work. Yeah. And there are various countries that are offering other models intentionally and consciously to the world. Look at the Chinese. They're saying our system works better. Mm-hmm. And they're more efficient in many ways than we are. But they say in order to do that, you have to give up your individual freedom a lot. And they say, but how important is that really? Mm-hmm. And a lot of people going, I'm not so sure, Here I am busting my hump and I'm barely getting by. Look at out there in Southern California. Your house market and rents are going up 10 and 25% a year.
Oh, yeah.
Regular people, where are they supposed to go? They're out there, they're camping out on the street now.
Yeah.
They got no place else to go. Mm-hmm. So it's late stage capitalism, but we haven't evolved another model for it. And the only other one that seems to work on a large scale is the Chinese system. But most of us Americans are not interested in doing that because we're too enamored, understandably, of our individuality and our sense of personal freedom. Mm-hmm. So we've got to figure out some other system that's going to work for us.
Yeah.
Well, I have no answers to that, but I know that what's happening now is not going to work. And most people also know that that's the case.
I know. But
what's going to come after that, I don't know. But so this is an exciting time. All these forces are coming together. Mm-hmm. And usually when there's a flux like this, there's usually a great deal of creativity that comes out of it that is unpredictable. Yeah, renaissance, and it's unpredictable. It's unpredictable what's going to happen, and no one particular person is in charge. Nobody. Yeah. We just have to collectively find our way. But hopefully, if we can go into our deeper instincts and recognize that person who looks very different than me is actually deep, deep, deep inside me. Mm-hmm. Is the same as me, has the same aspirations, has the same spirit, and is part of the same spirit, Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And this is an opportunity for people to take their religion seriously, not as a political football.
Yeah.
Let's take it seriously.
Right.
I mean, seriously. Are we all one family in the brotherhood and sisterhood of species, or are we not? Mm-hmm. Should get off the pot.
Right. Yep. Yeah. Well, we're talking about I just kind of went over to like a little bit of science and spirituality and the,
Mhm.
the upcoming wedge that we can see coming with the climate and all that stuff. And,
Mhm.
but if we go back to the previous wedge that we talked about, when the scientific racism came into being, and
Mhm.
it's, they were talking about the Greeks, the European culture was then focusing on the Greeks and the Romans. But,
Right.
you have, and someone mentioned this in the comments here, that we had Plato, right? And Plato in his
Yes.
dialogues was going, it's coming out of Egypt.
Yes, he said so. Plato was not. If you had Plato today, Plato would not be considered a racist. He was a Greek, but he thought the Greeks were superior to other people. But this wasn't because of the race.
Yeah.
He thought the Greeks were superior to the barbarians to the north of him, and to the west and to the east, because he was a Greek. It wasn't because he was a white man.
Yeah.
Because he was a Greek. But the ancient those of Greece, they felt that their civilization actually came from Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
and
The
they
mystery
worshiped.
schools.
Yes, their mystery schools came out of the Egyptian mystery schools, because Greece arose around 400, 350, 400 BC, whereas the ancient Egyptians were around for at least, in their present form, 5,000 years before Christ, and probably all the way back to 10,500 BC. Zep Tepi, splendid time of the first time. And there's ample evidence, archaeological hard data,
Hard science.
stones, monuments, alignments, to suggest that there were even civilizations prior to that that fell for reasons we don't know. But there are. So, there are great cycles. And that's what we began early on talking about, human beings having an intuition of cycles in nature, including cycles in the waters, cycles of the planets, cycles of the seasons, but also cycles in their own essence.
Okay. Well, so it wasn't necessarily Napoleon who started the concept, really, but he just
No.
had the cognitive dissonance of seeing this one thing where he knew, this is not aligning with
Right.
with the political agenda
And
that we're
some and,
pushing.
and some of the intellectuals in Napoleon's time said so also, and they wrote books about it. Those books they were popular for a while and then fell away. The most important one was one by a French nobleman, Count Volney. It was called The Ruin of Empires.
The Ruin of Empires.
The Ruin of Empires. And he talked about that long before Europe, there were these civilizations. Long before Europe rose out of the forest. Yeah, Count Volney, The Ruin of Empires. And so there were others too, Anacalypsis. Scientific racism had a job to do, and it did a pretty good job. It justified slavery. It justified mass incarceration, and it made the United States wealthy. Made the United States wealthy. The United States, imported Africans by the millions, and also in South America, and killed off the indigenous population, confined them to reservations, or exterminated them. It was a genocidal war. We don't like to think about that in America, but it was a pretty successful genocidal war. I mean, all the lands that we're on, I'm on, you're on, these ones belong to Native American, indigenous American peoples. We killed them off, essentially, and took over their lands. Now here we are.
Is there, we're going to go probably back to that Zep Tepi time, but as a side view, I imagine you've come across the Dogon tribe.
Yes.
In Africa. And their period of development, their high point in civilization, they had such an exquisite knowledge of star systems.
They did.
It boggles the mind. So maybe you want to talk about that and how it fits into
the Dogon people are still there, but at one time they were part of the empire of Mali in the northwestern Africa. which stretched for thousands of miles. They arose at somewhere around 1100 AD and persisted all the way to about, I think, around, as an empire, around 1500 AD, 15 or 1600 AD, around in there. But what was amazing about them is that they were great observers of the stars. And there may have been actually an expedition of sea trading folks from Mali to the Americas. There's ample evidence for that. But yeah, one of the peoples that the Empire of Mali, because it was an empire, ruled over were a group of people called the Dogon. And the Dogon had information about certain stars in the solar system that they knew about for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Information that was not revealed to Western telescopes until the 1860s, around in there. But they knew about the star Sirius. But what's more important, because you can see the star Sirius, is that they knew that Sirius had dark companion stars. And they knew about the orbit of those stars. How did they? And they knew that it was a heavy star. People didn't know about that until the beginning of the 20th century. How did they know that? It's an anomaly. The ancient Kemetic Egyptians also knew about the star Sirius. And that was part of their ritual and lore about the stars. They knew about the star Sirius. And there's suggestions that the peoples of Mali actually brought that information with them when they left Egypt and migrated to the western parts of Africa. Okay? But that knowledge has been the knowledge of humankind for thousands of years. Without the aid of telescopes, a different epistemology, a different way of knowing. And we're talking about bringing that way of knowing to add to, not supplant, but add to the treasury of human knowledge. But there's so many things that one of the residuals, one of the after effects of the fear of the African is that any knowledge that is associated with it becomes menacing. It's true, psychologically speaking, it becomes menacing. And to study it means you're studying the most pejorative kinds of things. You're studying black magic. You're studying hoodoo and voodoo in the most, and people forget that those are spiritual disciplines that people had to master. But anytime you see anything about Egyptian spirituality, West African spirituality, it immediately gets couched in negative terms. So what is one of the recurring things about ancient Egyptian spirituality? The mummy. People are terrified, and that is the propaganda. That is the official propaganda. And that is so that you won't study it. People forget that the ancient Kemetic Egyptians, they knew about the unconscious. They knew they used clinical hypnosis. They wrote books about it. They induced out-of-body experiences. They induced near-death experiences in the Great Pyramids of Giza. Those weren't burial chambers. That's propaganda again. The pharaohs were buried in the Valley of the Kings. They weren't buried in those pyramids. Pyramids were places of initiation into the solar mysteries. To elevate human consciousness. They did it for thousands of years. Yes. And they did it for thousands of years. Yes. So we're rediscovering that now.
And there's such a level, I think, for anyone who gets a hold of this information in the way that you're presenting it so clearly, it's frustrating to hear, frustrating. Like, okay, so, and, that's part of the reason why the propaganda is so tuned in well, is that you can just say a quick line and you watch a History Channel documentary. They'll say, in the burial tomb of King Tut, and you'll be like, what? So it's just like a one sentence deal. And it's like, all right, case closed, let's move on. And it's that quick, but the propaganda is that good.
It's that good, and it works. It's very effective. King Tut's tomb was not in one of the pyramids. It was in the Valley of the Kings.
Mm-hmm.
But when you hear it, you think, oh, he was buried in a pyramid. No, he wasn't buried in a pyramid. The pyramids were places of spiritual initiation into the mysteries. They induced out-of-body experiences. And the reason they did that was they wanted to get beyond any cognitive, intellectual doubt of the reality of the soul.
Wow.
When you're able to induce a situation where you physically leave your body and can move around outside of it, you don't have any more intellectual curiosity and doubt about it. You have experiential validation. In the Western world, the only times that happens, we put it in a negative context. I'm a clinical psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
I've induced states of hypnosis, lucid dreaming, and other phenomena of that in the clinical situation. You can create a situation that's referred to as dissociation,
mm-hmm.
in which it will mimic those phenomena, but it's always captured within the context of pathology.
Right.
Psychiatric, psychological, clinical pathology.
And then you could say from a pedestrian standpoint, oh, that's just crazy talk.
That's just crazy talk. Or it's an anomaly of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Or there's too much serotonin that's flooding the brain. Or they had the pineal gland release too much DMT. Mm-hmm. Or you can go on and on and on and on. But the reality of it is that it is real phenomena. We can induce it. And if you take away the negative framing, the psychiatric framing, you recognize there's a whole range of human experience that is available to us that our ancestors have been experimenting with for thousands of years. And that phenomena is connected to light, to our brains, and it connects us to a much wider ecology than our localized ecology here on the planet Earth. Right. That's why I emphasize again, a galactic solar consciousness, a solar consciousness. And so that is why, again, we are beginning, this is an exciting time. We're beginning to step off the planet as a species. Mm-hmm. We need to have our act together, psychologically and politically. Yeah. Because again, we don't know what we're going to find out there or who we're going to find out there. And it's just better to have your house in order.
Yeah, I mean, and before I get to the next question about house in order a bit, just tangentially, someone had asked, do you know about the stone circles in Senegambia? And does that have any sort of connection?
I know about the astronomy circles in not in Senegal. Those are the ones I don't know about, but I do know the ones in Nubia and in Egypt. Yes, and they were ancient sites of astronomical alignment, probably built around 5,000 BCE. Yes.
Okay.
And there are at least two of them in North and Northwest Africa. And they're kind of referred to as the African Stonehenge.
Right. And
yes.
Do you feel like there's, I mean, this information runs so deep. Do you think that there was some consciousness of the creators of Stonehenge who said, like, look, I'm having dreams about this stone circle. We got to build one here, Or do you think it was?
I don't know. Those were all built in the megalithic age. And there may very well have been a worldwide civilization back then that was lost. Every people on the planet, all the peoples on the planet have stories of the Great Flood.
Right.
That we were a fairly evolved civilization and something catastrophic happened and we were pushed back to the Stone Age. Mm-hmm. And it took, 6,000 years for us to crawl back. That is what the ancient Egyptians did say. Yeah. And they have the monuments in stone. They have the monuments in stone. The Sphinx, the alignment of the Sphinx, the way the pyramids will, the internal chambers of the pyramids. People sometimes forget that the insides of the chambers of the pyramids, particularly those in Giza, have certain shafts that allow light from certain constellations to come in at certain times of the solar year.
Yeah.
And that was connected with the idea of reconnecting with the stars. Well, if you think about the human brain, its capacity to absorb quanta, light,
Yes.
and you connect that with the initiations of the pyramids, you begin to get a glimpse of an age in which we have lost, but that we are still capable of reconnecting with because of the very structure of our brains. The very structure of our brains. They're the same brain as 50,000 years ago. The same brain.
See, that's the thing. Like the promise is still there. Like we better make
good
on it.
Yeah, it's still there. It's
Yeah.
still there, and it's our birthright. It's everybody's birthright. And there are, unfortunately, too many people whose political power depends on keeping people ignorant and fighting with each other.
Yeah.
Yes, and keeping us afraid of each other. And the propaganda, as you point out, is very effective.
Yeah.
You know, name me one widespread African spirituality that is not suspect here in the Western world. Name me one.
Right. They've all been relegated to.
Right. Whereas getting super excited and raising the spirits and having it overwhelm your body is seen as something horrific and dangerous. But if you travel to ancient Greece and you look at the Dionysian cults in the Elysian fields, it's presented the same thing, presented in a very different way. That is scientific and political racism. That is what that is. That is what that is. The same phenomena, but in one context it is acceptable, it's something to be looked up to, and the other one is something to be feared. That is how deep the propaganda goes.
Yeah.
It's very effective.
Oh, absolutely. But you know, we think about that 10,500 years ago or so.
BC.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. So even more than that, you know.
Yes.
But these architects, these engineers of consciousness and their ability to do this monumental works in stones correlated with constellations.
Yes.
Their consciousness alone must have been just mammoth and shared. And there's been some sort of almost telepathic connection.
Well, between
everyone, say like, we want to build this thing, and you know, Joe over here knows how to build it too, and like, yes, we're going to do it. We're going to do it, and it's going to happen. And that's insane.
Some synchronicity of collective thought processes. Yes. Well, you know who believed in that, and who believed in telepathy and what's called psi phenomena or anomalous phenomena?
Yes.
Two very famous psychiatrists in the early part of psychiatry. Carl Jung believed in it, wrote a book about it, and so did Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud wrote about it in clinical articles. He was very ambivalent about it. Sometimes he said, yeah, this is what's going on. Then he'd say, well, no, but that's ridiculous. That can't be true. And then he'd turn around again, well, but there are then these circumstances. And he documents it in his clinical studies.
Yeah.
You know, he refers to it, a clinical phenomenon that goes on between a patient and analyst, analyst, and he referred to it as thought transference.
Yes.
And he described the dynamics very clearly. And Jung referred to it as synchronicity. Slightly different, but they're close enough. Right. So both of those two leading figures accepted it. Yeah. One with ambivalence and the other one wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jung actually worked with a physicist, Wolfgang Pauli, and they tried to sort of formulate it into a quantum mechanical principle that they described it, but it wasn't tight enough, clinically speaking, really. But Freud was much more tightly clinical, but he was ambivalent about it.
Yeah.
So my point is that the two greatest founders of psychiatry in the last century embraced it. And it's their followers who didn't.
Yeah.
It's their followers who did not have the courage or the imagination.
Well, it's certainly courage, because I think, maybe Freud was being political about his ambivalence.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. He was very concerned. Freud was getting psychoanalysis out of the aura of seances and mediumship. He was very concerned about that. And so he made political decisions to do that. And I can understand that. He wanted it to be seen within the context of quote unquote science and not mediumship and other things. So he made a political decision. I understand it, respect it.
Yeah.
And probably as a result of it, psychoanalysis got its own legs,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a hard road to hoe,
Well, I mean, there was one funny incident that Jung spoke about. Jung and Freud were having this discussion / argument about this very thing.
Mm-hmm.
And Freud was saying, this is a bunch of horse manure.
Mm-hmm.
It was in that negative phase. And Jung was saying, no, this is very real. This is what is going on in the world, da, 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 da. And Freud, no. And then Jung made a prediction right there. He said, in a minute, that knife over there on the some kind of instrument on a shelf is going to shatter. And Freud said, you're full of shit. And all of a sudden the thing shattered. Freud fainted. And Jung picked him up and took him out to the room and put him on the couch.
Yeah, and this was in a parlor.
True story.
Yeah.
True story.
Yeah.
True story. Yeah. And these were the two great founders of the art and science of psychotherapy in the modern world.
Well, it kind of speaks to the idea, though, if you have an open heart and you're going in an open mind, perhaps you can be more easily clued into things as they happen, before they happen, and when they may happen.
Yes.
One of, like, going back to these ancient architects and engineers in Africa, how do you think this? You talked about the explosion, the Cambrian explosion of imagination and rationality that they had, geometric knowledge, star correlations and things like that. The actual knowledge, how do you think it came about? I mean, was there a little bit more about that? I mean, Jung spoke about the collective unconscious, like this deep, dark reservoir that we all kind of share. Were they riding that edge so finely that they could say, like, oh, there's a good idea, let's do this?
Well, my sense is that they did not have the prejudices that we do about what is possible and what's not possible.
Okay.
And so they were able to enter into trance states, either with the induction using a medication or a rhythmic incantation, but various ways of entering into trance states, and then complete identification with the cosmos. And if you have complete identification with it, you know it. And then when you come back out of it, you bring that knowledge with you. That's the hero's journey. And they brought back, and reason I'm suggesting that is because some of the knowledge, much of the knowledge, is very precise.
Yeah, that's the thing.
There are star maps in the pyramids, Pyramid Unas, for one, that are very precise about the alignment of the stars. There are stories and rituals of the Dogon that are very precise about the orbits of the stars that we don't even see with our eyes, and weren't even able to do that, as we pointed out, until the mid-1860s. But they knew about it. How did they know? And how did they know the stars were in that revolution unseen around the planet? And how did they know it was a 60-year cycle? And how did they know that dark star that is unseen by the naked eye was a heavy star?
Right.
How did they know that?
Yeah. That's the question. I mean,
I mean, the only
it's hyper advanced. It's hyper advanced even for, like, someone, I'm living in Silicon Valley, right? And I'm looking at laptops. I'm like, this is pretty cool. This like, but in a way, this is more advanced.
Yes, yes, because they explored, they allowed themselves to explore areas of the human consciousness, our human consciousness, that have been off limits for us for a long while, taboo. We have certain, as enlightened as we think we are in this age, and we are in many ways, we still have blind spots.
Yeah.
We still do not allow for spirit travel. We say, that's a biochemical illusion that is not real, because by definition it can't happen, and so therefore by definition it is an illusion. Right. So therefore out-of-body experiences is a cognitive distortion and illusion. A near-death experience, well, that's a biochemical phenomenon of your brain. We can explain it away
reductively,
right, but the people who have the experience, they don't think that.
Right.
They don't think that at all.
And
that includes a number of physicians who were skeptics, who had the near-death experience themselves, and then they told a different story when they came back. And there are several books out there written by physicians who worked in the emergency room, who saw this happen with a number of their patients, and would always be very, well, these things happen, and just sort of a skeptical, but let's be kind to my patient, and so on and so forth, and dismissed it until they had the experience. And then,
right.
and then what happened? They found that their colleagues were looking at them going, no, he's lost it.
Right. And so that then the society has this self-correcting procedure.
and then you're pushed out of the club. Right. It happens a lot.
And
it happens a lot.
A question that we had come up here is, do you think a lot of African American culture isn't open to this information at this point? And do you have a take on that?
I think African American culture, from what I see, is very split about it. It's very split. A certain percent of African Americans are open to this because they're embracing spiritual lineages that come directly out of Africa, particularly East Africa, in the middle of Africa. West African.
Okay.
Through the civilizations of Mali, Benin, there were several other civilizations that rose and fell in West Africa from about 800 AD to about 1860. There were a number of them that came and went. But many of the traditions were brought over from there, the authentic earth religion of Voodoo, Santiara, several others. Some of them went directly to Brazil. Yeah, so there are a lot of them, And so they're open to those and very devout about it. The other significant part of African American culture is very surprisingly conservative Christian.
Okay.
What do I mean conservative Christian? I mean, if it does not come through Jesus Christ, it isn't real, and it isn't worth it. And therefore, we'll write off all the others as crazy. Okay, so it's split. It's split.
But that's almost reinforcing the gatekeeper, a little bit.
To some extent. Some of it is an authentic belief and acceptance of tenets of Christianity in a certain way, and that's okay. But the others, to me, are more interesting because they are more cosmic, and they are more in line with my intuition of our own individual consciousness coming into direct alignment with our spiritual and cosmic consciousness, and help us move toward being the kind of solar beings that I intuit that we are. We really are truly luminous beings, and you don't have to be thinking about Star Wars to go in that direction. Again, the nature of our the structure of our nervous system, our brains, are structured and designed to absorb light, to absorb quanta, and to translate it into higher states of expression. We literally are luminous beings. And that is how we have evolved in evolution. Evolution is about becoming more complex. You know, the physical universe is often described by physicists and others as one of negative entropy, meaning that the order in the universe is becoming more, not random, but more spread out and less cohesive coming out of the Big Bang. Big Bang, everything was very organized and tight and cohesive. And as it spread out in entropy, there's more disorder. Yet the whole phenomenon of life is the opposite of that. It is about increasing order and increasing complexity. So the living process, the living organism, is about negative entropy.
Yeah.
And that is one of the great contradictions, not contradictions. That is the current world paradigm that we are in. That is the current world paradigm. And that is going to shift, and we don't know how it's going to shift, because those two look like they're at opposite ends, and they can't be, because they're both in the same universe. But we haven't figured out a way out of that one yet.
That's a hell of a point right there. They are in the same universe.
They're in the same universe.
Yeah,
so they have to work together somehow, but we just don't know yet. We haven't elucidated that.
Yeah. And
I have a sense that it'll have something to do with insight, intelligence, and light. That's my intuition about that.
I like to flesh that out just a little bit more. I mean, it's like you said, we're on this precipice between potential galactic civilization and killing each other. And that's like that's a crazy equation to be looking at. But
yeah,
I mean, your very considered approach, if you had the chance to sit everybody at a table, you know, and say, like, look, there's a couple social things we need to be looking at. There's a couple practices, beliefs. There's a couple things we need to be putting higher on the agenda for how we're going to look at how we're going to spend our money and our budgets and all this stuff. I mean, and also at the same time, where we start on the individual level. I don't know. That's a huge question, but I mean,
well, one of them would be the psychological exercise of being able to identify with the persons in the situations you most dislike.
Wow.
To be able to find yourself in that situation which you project outward as a negative thing. Yes, because it is part of you in some way. Everything is in each other, and everybody else is in each other, and we're all represented in each other. You know, we have what do you call it, an inverse square relationship. Minority representation of me is in you in some fragmented way, and vice versa. It's like the analogy I use in our African unconscious is of, and in dark light consciousness is of a hologram.
Oh, wow.
A hologram is that, you know, it's a picture, blurred picture, but you can take a tiny slice of that huge blurred picture, and from it, the light going through it a certain way, you can reconstruct the entire figure.
Yeah.
Well, we all have that in us. We all have all of the other in us. And under the right circumstances, right context, right disciplines, we can find ourselves in every other person. All in each in all. As above, so below. As within, so without. That's the Hermetic lineage that comes out of the lineage of Thoth, who was the great Egyptian progenitor. That comes straight out of ancient Kemetic Egypt. And then it migrated after thousands and thousands of years to Greece. And then after hundreds of years to Rome. And then after that to the Renaissance. but its origin is ancient Kemetic Egypt. All in each in all. You know, as above, so below, as within, so without.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's that's so transformative on individual basis, which would then spread out to hopefully
Right.
the social
Right.
network, you know.
Right. And we would develop a science of empathy based upon identification and light with each other. So, you know, that's how we will survive, is through empathy. We're not going to survive through war. We will survive through empathy, because each one of us now has increasing capacity to do enormous amount of harm.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Mm-hmm.
One person can, my God, buy a weapon of mass destruction, load it up, go into a shopping mall, and take out 30 people.
Yeah.
I mean, so we've got to tame that guy. We've got to tame that creature.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because if we continue to get angrier and angrier because our systems are not working for us, more and more people will feel, I've got nothing to lose. The system is rigged.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'm sorry, there aren't enough police.
Yeah.
We can't predict. We have to change. There has to be a quantum leap, I believe, in our consciousness and in our capacity for empathy.
And can
this is the next stage in the evolution of our species, I believe.
And I certainly agree. If we take it upon ourselves, the awesome responsibility that we have to one another and ourselves and
Yes.
future generations all the way through,
Mm-hmm.
and our ancestors all the way back, you know.
Right.
I mean, the practicality of teaching this in like public schools, or I mean, like, what is there a method, a channel? Because yeah, as you alluded to several times, it does feel like the game is rigged, and everybody kind of intuitively knows that it can't keep going like this.
Right. Yeah. It can't keep going on like this. It's going to fall apart. And we just don't know yet what is going to replace it. But there are glimmers. We do know that there are levels of consciousness above our ego consciousness. We know that. We know that. Anybody who's had a profound insight, anybody who's ever been deeply in love, anyone that's had a moment or moments of enormous creativity and insight into the workings of how the universe operates, either in science or in the arts or spirituality or whatever, knows that there's a level of consciousness that we get glimmers of.
Right.
You know, and we also have methodologies and disciplines that can get a person there. We know that. And that, I think, eventually will become part of what we learn in school. We'll learn how to enter the contemplative mind eventually in school. And that'll be a deeper beginning of that, because we have to evolve that consciousness. Otherwise, we're not going to make it. We're simply not going to make it.
Not at all.
No, we're not.
And the whole thing's going to end a lot faster and more violently and terribly than, you know, anyone has an idea of.
We, at this very moment, we're on the edge of war again. We are. And, you know, what the real story will be, we don't know. As someone said, in war, truth is the first casualty.
Mm-hmm.
Once the shooting starts, after that, it'll just be propaganda wars.
Yep.
Right. It's been propaganda now, but after that, and long-term wars these days are not sustainable. Yeah. It's not over very quickly. Then it devolves into a really long, bloody, and it's so we're on the edge of it at this very moment.
Yeah. So
that's why I hold out hope for our species. We've been able to pull a rabbit out of our hat. Time.
Yeah.
I hope we'll be able to do it again this time.
Mm.
Mm. Not without a lot of, you know, but that's what they say about, you know, about people getting born. Nobody gets born without some screaming and some blood.
Yeah.
Maybe that's, maybe that's how it's supposed to be. I don't know. But uh, uh, we are evolving. We are continuing to evolve. And yet we are the same species. We are being and we are becoming at the same time.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, there's, I just want everyone in the world to hear this talk. I just want people to recognize, what's at stake if they're not already kind of intuitively understanding that there is, the game's afoot and you got to play,
Yeah, you do. And I also believe that intuitively, even those who really, really don't like the idea,
Mhm.
they still intuitively know, if they're an educated person,
Mhm.
that our species emerged out of Africa. They may argue that, well, yeah, but higher forms of us came out and developed in Europe, or we developed in China. No. That's the scientific propaganda part. What we do know is that we're all the same. Underneath the skin, in our brain core, our anatomy, so forth. And we recognize that also that gives rise to a certain kind of consciousness. If we can turn our attention back onto that, we will realize that, we are indeed beings who live on light in some interesting sort of way. And that is what our real destiny is, what our real identity is, beneath all the surface stuff. And it's very hopeful.
Yeah.
And it correlates with what all the great religious traditions tell us. All of them. They tell us this repeatedly.
Yeah.
And so I just say to people, take whatever your religious belief is, drain the politics out of it and listen deeply to the theology, drain the political sewage away. Right. And listen to the tenets of what the great masters of your traditions have told you about the nature of the soul, the nature of your relationship with your brothers and sisters, and ultimate destiny of the human spirit. And then we'll be okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's that saying that, Jesus, protect me from your followers, it's like that prayer, but and I think about that one sometimes, but like, I also feel that if we're able to transform, it's in our hands to do so.
It is. And the great masters have told us that. You mentioned Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. Jesus Christ left a methodology. People tend to overlook that. But he left a methodology also, in addition to different teachings about love and so forth. Mm-hmm. But he said, when the eye is single, the body is full of light. When the eye is single, you focus your attention, and the eye is single, your whole body will become illuminated with light. It's a methodology. That's right out of Raja Yoga. It's right out of Kundalini Yoga.
Yeah, don't forget it.
Be ye wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Wise as serpents, the serpents coming up along the pillar, medical caduceus, until they reach the wings at the top. Wise as serpents, and then take flight, harmless as doves. Medical caduceus is a spiritual symbol. That was Jesus Christ of Nazareth. The Buddha says much the same thing. Krishna says much the same thing. Muhammad says the same thing in a different way. Zoroaster, or Zarathustra said the same thing. All the great masters. Why? Because they have the same nervous system as you and me.
Yeah.
Has the same nervous system as you and me.
And they're just trying to get the message through. Hey, guys.
Right.
Wow. Yeah. Well, boy, if this wasn't a barn burner of a discussion, Dr. Edward, this was amazing. And I can't thank you enough. And for the people who signed up, they will get a recording in about 24 hours emailed to them. But we're all grateful. And is there any sort of words of wisdom you want to leave us with? I mean, that was all words of wisdom in my book.
I got no notes. We just spoke spontaneously, and obviously the things are much more well thought through and organized in what I wrote. But
yeah, please pick up the book if you haven't. Please pick up the book.
And it's an audio book, so it's also an audio book. But the main thing is that folks take seriously their spiritual and religious practices and beliefs, and you also have to do it. It's not enough to believe it. You have to do it. Praxis, one kind or another. And again, up until this point, we've always, again, pulled a rabbit out of our hat. So here we are on the verge of war again. The big boys in the testosterone storm. It's the war again,
Same old song.
Same old song.
Yeah.
But that's how they maintain power. And keeping us fearful of each other is a well-paying job.
Oh man.
Yeah.
I mean, I think basically the next step for me is to buy multiple copies of your book and hand it to everybody that I know.
Well, I just hope you're kind enough to get a copy for yourself.
Yeah, no, I got that.
Play with it. But I think I just happen to be the person who's saying it. If it wasn't me, it would be somebody else. Because why? It's in the ether. It's in the air. There's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And this is an evolutionary idea whose time has come. It's scientifically, medically obvious. And it's just a matter of who puts it down. And I just happen to put it down.
That was beyond humble. But once again, I'd just like to thank you from East West Bookstore, and thank you for a wonderful evening, and for the questions that were typed into the chat. They were very helpful as well in guiding our discussion. eastwestbooks.org, you can see our upcoming events. We have actually talked tomorrow on the discoveries in human potential science, psi science. And
yes.
It's going to be talking from a standpoint of a person who's well-versed in the actual science, but he's looking at it and trying to take it out of the ivory tower into practicality.
Yes.
And, in that practice that you shared with us earlier this evening about seeing a small part of yourself and the other person you're having conflict with, I mean, that's a powerful practice. Obviously thinking of yourself as light and being open to that light is a powerful practice.
Right.
And, we'd love to have you come back again, Dr. Edward, and, pontificate more and preach more and tell us more.
I'm just speaking very directly. As I said, you and I sort of like we said, we would just take and run with it, and we did, and I had a good time, and I hope folks found it useful and interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much. And everyone have a great night. Thank you, Dr. Ed.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank